Hey, welcome back. So today I wanted to talk a bit about Sweet Home Alabama and the classic argument between usually G major and D Mixolydian. Some people say D major. We'll get into that. I was just arguing with enough people about this. I've had enough recurring arguments where I said the same points, but I have to type them entirely and say them to one person, and it feels a bit like arguing with a flat earther or a creationist or something. It never doesn't actually make any difference. So instead, I figured I'd just make a video with all necessary components, photos, proof, whatever, and then if they still don't want to believe it, then that's their own prerogative at that point. But at least I don't have to keep retyping it over and over again. But on top of that, we'll also get to talk about concepts of tonality versus modality, which we may have touched on in some other videos, but it is an important topic for understanding all the intricacies of this song and people's analyses of it. So the first thing to really bring up is some definitional things that I've seen a problem with, and just get those out of the way. Tonic. Tonic is an ambiguous term. You can look it up on Wikipedia and see its many uses. It's a bit annoying, but the tonic can refer to just the one chord in any major or minor key. That's one tonal definition of it. The tonic can refer to any root chord, root tone, even in the relative modes. That's another definition. Or tonic can just refer to any general root without concepts of modality or tonality. So tonic is not a good word to use. Now let's also talk about the word keys. The reason a lot of people have a problem with understanding this is that they never learned modes as its own thing, its own scale and language and harmony. Instead, they've learned it only from the relative mode position, which means that if I see any of the modes of G major, it's in the key of G major. Progressions can be in a modal space without needing to reference tonality. Remember, key is a tonal word. Key has to do with key signatures. It has to do with dominant chords, 5 chords, cadencing back to a 1 chord or a tonic chord. It really makes no sense to think about a modal progression by using the word key. Modal progressions are not in a key. They're in a mode. So there's no reason to reference back the relative key. That's just showing your tonality bias. 95% of music is in tonality, is in a key, essentially. So it makes sense why you would have a bias, because most music that you experience is in a key. But when you run into a progression or a song that doesn't have what we would call the traditional tonal concepts, it really makes no sense to try to relate that back to key just because you're biased towards it. So another thing we need to bring up is sheet music. Sheet music is a wonderful writing system. It's a writing device that allows us to quickly read music. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's important to understand that it comes from a tonal point of history where European composers were playing in major and minor keys, and the whole system hinges largely on the fact that you're in a key. Therefore, modal progressions have to be written in a key signature or with tonal kind of concepts attached to them in order to put them on the sheet music, but that doesn't mean that they're actually tonal in origin. There are two ways that people usually go about transcribing modal progressions, modal music, into sheet music. And they have to choose one of two paths, basically. Some schools of thought are like, if you're in D Mixolydian, you should transcribe it to its relative key, so G major. Because Mixolydian is a major key, they're probably going to say, you're transcribing to G major. We know that E minor is the same exact key signature as G major, but you're usually going to verbalize it as G major. If we were transcribing A Dorian, we might say we're transcribing it in E minor, because then that makes more sense. Dorian is a minor mode, so therefore we should think about it being related to a minor key. So even though in those examples, D Mixolydian and A Dorian, they're both in the key center of G major, E minor, we would change our verbiage based on if it's a major mode, it should go with G major. If it's a minor mode, it should go with E minor. Makes sense? Just a partition there. So that's one way, that's the relative way of thinking about it, and it's pretty common. Most people would say do this one, because to me it lessens the accidentals. It makes it so that you don't need any extra accidentals in the sheet music. And to me the whole point of a key signature is there to lessen accidentals. Otherwise, why not just write everything in C and put as many accidentals as you want? Then we wouldn't even have a need for key signatures. Key signatures' whole purpose to me is to lessen accidentals. However, that being said, there are other schools that do it a different way, and it doesn't bother me now. It used to bother me, maybe I would argue about it a little bit, but now I understand it. So they would say D Mixolydian is a major mode, so therefore you should transcribe it in D major, and you should change every time a C sharp comes along, you should naturalize it back to a C. So this puts in the composer's mind, they know that the tonic is strongly D major. And then they're just changing some of the other notes, right? The 2, 4, 6, or 7. They're changing those notes to fit their mode as they need. This is understandable, but it comes from a perspective of that the key signature's whole purpose is to display the tonic chord, which to me it's not really. To me the tonic chord is meant to be inferred by the player. The point of a key signature again is to lessen accidental usage. So in the case of A Dorian for this school, they would prefer to see it transcribed in A minor. And then in A minor, when an F comes along, they would have to sharp it to make that an F sharp or a natural 6 in the scale. So again, they know that the tonic going into it is A minor definitively. They just have to change that 6th degree in order to make it Dorian for them. Again, I understand the system, I just don't agree with the logic of it, the point of a key signature. But both systems are valid and in use. Now, to begin to understand modal progressions and the Roman numerals of how we analyze them or talk about them, I wanted to bring up some famous examples so that we could look at them together and kind of decide if we can get on the same page with that. The first one will be Oye Como Va by Santana. This progression is A minor 7 to D9. Now, if that seems a little overly complicated, let's just make it A minor to D. We can just reduce it down. A minor to D is a 2 to 5 movement if we're thinking about the key of G major. But here's where it doesn't make any sense to think about the key of G major. We're in A Dorian. This is an A Dorian progression. Therefore, we would write this as 1 minor to 4 major, back and forth. A Dorian vamp. If someone asked you what key this song is in, you could say G major, as it would kind of make sense, but the more accurate answer is it's in A Dorian. If someone asked me what key it was in, I would say the relative key is G major, but it's in A Dorian. So as we said before with the sheet music thing, Oye Como Va, if you were writing it in sheet music, you could write it in G major, relative, or again E minor, relative, both are the same key signature. Or you could write it in A minor key signature and sharpen every F. When people argue and they say, well, it's in A minor because the sheet music says so, it doesn't make it that way. It's still a modal progression. It's not in either key. We're just using key concepts, tonal concepts, to write out something that is modal in nature. So as the next example, let's take a look at Jane Says. This same progression has been used in with a Fleetwood Mac song that's famous. Here Comes My Girl. Tom Petty uses this movement. This is what we would call, if we were talking again in major key, we would give this the Roman numerals 4 and 5. And while that may be helpful to figure out how you're going to solo on the progression, it's not really accurate. The way we should write this Lydian progression is major 1, major 2. That's it. That's the correct way to write the Roman numerals on that progression. And if we look at Jane Says, uses G and A major as the chords. So therefore people would say we're in D major. But we're not, because we're not in a key of D major. We're just in G Lydian, and that's all there is to it. And you could write the sheet music with a D major, again, relative mode, or you could write it in G major and just change every fourth. Let's do one more. Fire on the Mountain, Grateful Dead, B major to A major. Again, if we were thinking of this from the major key perspective, and we saw B and A, we would write the Roman numerals 5 and 4, which again is okay, but it has no tonic. There is no such thing as a progression that doesn't have some kind of tonic. Or root. Catch me on using the word tonic there. But so we know that the root is B. It is in B Mixolydian. Now we could say that that is related to E major, C sharp minor, but there's really no need to. It's in B Mixolydian, that's all there is to it. There's no reason to complicate it with key signature stuff, with tonal concepts. If we were to transcribe Fire on the Mountain in sheet music, we could either use B major, the parallel key, and then just change every 7th degree, or we could use E major and not have to use as many accidentals, and that would work too. But it doesn't change the fact that the progression is in B Mixolydian. We're just using keys as a way of writing a modal progression. Now, another important topic is just is in. And what I mean by that is we can say it's in D Mixolydian. But to say it's in the key of D Mixolydian doesn't make any sense. You're just mixing tonal and modal concepts. I just throw that away. I know what you mean, but it just is word salad at that point. And then to say it's in the key of anything when you're looking at a modal progression is just, again, throw it away. You're not thinking tonally, you're thinking modally for this one. So a little bit in Sweet Home Alabama. One point that really points to D being the root note is the vocal melody. Now in the vocal melody, he often begins singing on an F sharp, which would be the 3rd of the D chord that is being played. Now that's pretty standard for being in D. If it were in G, that would be starting to sing on the 7th degree of the scale, which wouldn't make a lot of sense to say that it's in G. Then he ends the first phrase with a little D, E, then he ends the next phrase with some solid D. Basically, every single line of the verse starts on the F sharp and then somehow meanders down to a D, where there are many Ds sang in a row on the C and the G chord. Now, D is a note that's in G major, so it sounds pleasant. It is the 5th of G major. It's just not something you would normally do if the song was in G. The song is in D. Another point to address is there is a little point in the chorus. It's a tiny little tag that goes F, C, G. And that is a Plagal cascade, right? F to C is a 4-to-1, C to G is a 4-to-1. They do, in that moment, tonicize the G for just a minute. And they do that to end the song so that they can end it on G as well. And it does tonicize the G for that second. But then when they go back to the regular D Mixolydian progression, they're just in D again. That F would be a borrowed chord, would be a flat 3 chord in D Mixolydian. And that's fairly standard. That's a bluesy chord to use. Another point is Ed King. What he says first of all, that he says it's in G major, and that's enough for some people. That's just a weird way to think of it. If I wrote a song in E flat minor, but told you that it's in E minor, would it be in E minor? No. Music theory is descriptive of what is happening. It's not prescriptive. So what someone says they wrote versus what they actually wrote doesn't really matter. You can analyze something impartially from the creator's point of view. If I made a painting but told you it was a vase, it was a pottery piece, I mean, I'd just be wrong. That's all there is to it. This is just an appeal to authority fallacy, right? He's the author, so he can just say whatever the heck he wants and we have to accept it. I don't fall for that. Ed King did not know that much about theory, especially at the time that he wrote the song, but maybe even still to this day, he may not be deeply aware of theory concepts. So, I mean, take it with a grain of salt. He plays the solo in G major, but a fellow YouTuber, Paul Davids, did a breakdown, I'll include it below, about how the solo played in G, he plays the exact same solo that Ed King played, but plays it in D major, and it actually sounds a lot better. It sounds a lot more appropriate to the song. But yeah, the G major that Ed King uses has a slightly different scratchiness to it, a chickenish sound that does go well with the barnyard sort of sound that Sweet Home Alabama is trying to make. But what it is it's the only difference between the two, G major pentatonic or D major pentatonic, is just F sharp versus G. So when he's using that G over a D Mixolydian progression, he's emphasizing the fourth degree of the scale a lot, which is often an avoid note. People say not to play the fourth, but he's using it a lot, and it makes it sound awkward, but unique. So yeah, I mean, I like it. There's nothing wrong with it. It is unique, but it doesn't mean that you can analyze a progression based on what melodic content goes over the top of it. Someone could solo whatever the heck they want on top of something. The progression still stands as a harmonic composition in itself. You analyze a progression, then if you try to force a mode onto it, it's not going to work. Like, it just is what it is. So now I've come closer to the end. I've got one more piece here, which is Back in Black. If you listen to Back in Black, it's E, D, A, and then a little pause for a noodle, which is actually very similar to what happens in Sweet Home Alabama, which is D, C, G, and a little noodle. Thinking of the major key, you could write this 5, 4, 1, noodle. Now, that noodle portion is crucial. It is crucial. If someone played a progression that was D, C, G, D, I don't think people would be arguing as much that it's not in D. I think the problem is that the G carries on more, that carries on longer, and so people feel like because they play that the longest, that must be the home, you know. It adds gravity to the argument, even though it's fallacious. But I think in Back in Black, also, the E to D to A, I hear, like if I were to play any chord over the noodle, it would be another A at that point. I don't think it's E, D, A, E, but that's something else you could do. Even though the noodle is in E minor or whatever, I still think that there's a kind of an implied A major chord on that noodle part. And that means that these two progressions in my mind are almost identical. Now, what is different about them? Melodic content. We already said harmonically, if they're the same progression, they should be analyzed the same. And everyone would give the answer E Mixolydian for Back in Black. So therefore, they should give D Mixolydian for Sweet Home Alabama. But if we look at what Angus Young is doing on it, he's soloing clearly in E minor, which is using the bluesy minor pentatonic scale over an E Mixolydian progression. He also has some moments of E Mixolydian clearly in there as well. So it becomes hard to argue that it's in A major. But this is the exact equivalent of what people are doing when they argue that Sweet Home Alabama is in G major. is the same as saying that Back in Black is in A major, which it clearly is not. The only reason that they're confused is because of what Ed King says and because of what he plays over the top of it. So they think that it has to be that way. Okay, so I think that's about all for now. Hopefully that exposes some ideas of tonal harmony versus modal harmony, tonality versus modality, and why we can say it's in the relative key of G major, but it's just not very helpful. Just start thinking like a modal person, a person who's able to see modes as their own scales and as their own harmonic environments. You don't need to relate everything back. Sure, if you're trying to figure out which scale pattern to play, yes, in my mind I'm going to say it's all the same scale shapes as G major. But I want to think of D Mixolydian and that home and all the chords related to D and their function back to D, not to G, because G is the fourth of the progression. I mean, I could go on and on, but hopefully some of that persuades you to think of it a little differently. All right, until